So I am excited to welcome to the podium with me, Cat Goughnour.
Goughnour. Yes.
I was very close, who is a racial equity fellow at Prosperity Now. Cat leads strategy for Prosperity's racial, economic, and wealth equity portfolio, which includes building the organizational capacity to design, develop, and operationalize and elevate human-centered solutions. She has a background in social science, community economic development, and a focus on historically marginalized communities. Welcome, Cat.
Thank you, Tamira.
I'm also very happy to have Bobby Milstein. Bobby directs system strategy for Rethink Health and Rippel, and is a visiting scientist at MIT Sloan School of Management. Bobby's background combines cultural anthropology, behavioral science, and systems science, focusing on efforts to spark large-scale institutional and cultural change. Please join me again in welcoming them both. So you both have incredibly impressive titles and backgrounds. I would love it if you tell my colleagues and my trustees and fund holders and friends, what are you up to? Tell us about the work that you're doing and the things you care about. Kat, you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you, everyone, for having us in this very important conversation. Congratulations on reaching a monumental goal in a very short amount of time to address racial economic inequality, the racial wealth gap, some of the most pressing issues of our time, I think. I'm excited to be here to kind of talk about what's been trending across the country over the past few years as a theoretician and a practitioner. I always like to say that my work is personal, it's political, and it's my profession. Luckily, I was born in a time where we can work on these wicked and long-standing issues and to change society in a very profound way, thinking about how institutions, systems, and structures can actually work alongside and in partnership with the people who've been historically marginalized, left out, left behind. We have many ways of talking about the people we serve and the people who feel like they also don't belong, but also are so excited for partnership and new avenues to actually create programs, services, investments that change their economic and material reality. So I'm excited to talk with you more and learn from all of you about what's meaningful.
When we were prepping for the call, we talked a lot about notions around the role of values in helping us to recenter and move from the polarization, all of the challenges that we're facing. Can you talk a little bit, expound a little bit about the role of values in this framework that you introduced around bridge, block, build?
Yeah.
Would you mind?
Yeah, so much of the script on how we address problems in the world first leads with a problem, and then we skip to topics and tactics, and that's a formula for addressing specific issues in a world where we are faced and beset by more challenges than any of us can count. But it also has this effect of fragmenting our attention, fragmenting our resources, and maybe getting us a little bit out of touch with the broader unifying values, the things that we widely share, and the things that we most want to create in the world through our work. And then how do we situate those broad values for health and well-being, for justice and fair opportunities, for everybody feeling that they belong, everybody feeling that they have things to bring in this work? There are, poll after poll shows vast majorities of people have these strong unifying values, but they're unable or do not see a way to actually convert those values into action in the moment. And when we don't talk enough about those unifying human values, we end up very quickly polarized around topics and tactics, and who's got a proposal that somebody else might see threatens them. We turn into a zero-sum conversation. We don't have enough resources to go around, this kind of myth of scarcity disconnects us from the assets that we actually share around things that we are able to do together. And so this is a lesson learned the hard way from change makers like those of you in the room who know what it takes to actually position the big we and the why first and have that discussion about why is it in all of our interest to make sure that no one's left behind? Why is it in everybody's interest to build a system that's created for everybody to thrive together? Now, we don't live in a world where that system exists, but we can create it. And then it's through the shared stewardship, the actions that we can take together that allow us to be able to do things that none of us can do alone. And so I do think it's very hard to do, if not impossible, unless we begin with those core unifying values that fortunately many people still share. They're just thirsty for a way to live into them.
You know, I appreciate that. And Kat, when we were talking, and I know that you've experienced this in the context of your own career, but even the notion of the racial wealth gap for some might feel polarizing. Could you talk about how the racial wealth gap actually could center around shared values? Could you talk about that a bit?
Absolutely. I also just want to piggyback off of what Bobby shared about will and skill. Really thinking about the work that we do at Prosperity Now, which used to be called Corporation for Enterprise Development. How do we work with people closest to the problem to develop solutions? And coming up with notions around economic inclusion, then bridging to the racial wealth gap was a significant leap for people on the ground, human service organizations, community members who understand, gaps with work, with wages, but this wealth gap and the astronomical number that we put out often makes people feel disempowered. So how do we think about this as something that whole communities can lean into? There have been some really interesting research reports over the past 3 years. I think you all are familiar. Citibank did an analysis that said over the past 20 years, $17 trillion has been lost due to Black exclusion alone. If we think about communities who've been excluded and start to aggregate what could be possible for our overall economy as well as individuals, I think that gives a lot of energy and momentum to people. Broader analyses also about the cost of exclusion for individual groups, intersections with race and gender. African American women was $50 billion a year, a research report showed, due to the wage gap. So there are really big opportunities to think about how a more robust economy helps in these times in particular when we are having so much impact from inflation, kind of what is happening after the pandemic, and also seeing how wealth and health intersect. I think one of the clarion calls that came out of the pandemic was understanding that economic inequality drives and is a significant contributor to impacts around mortality. That was something that hadn't yet really been understood as a society. So what is the protective opportunity of economic inclusion, and how do these amazing pilots you're thinking about, putting money directly into the pockets of people, actually contribute to broader economic progress for the entire country?
Yeah, I didn't answer your question about bridge, block, and build, but that is, in many ways you're talking about all of those elements. The bridging is the idea that we are connected to each other's lives, and we really need to stretch across lines of color or class or party or sort of geography in ways to feel and connect that interdependence more fully. So this problem of the racial wealth gap is not just a problem for the people on the low end of that gap. It is a problem for the entire society, and so the bridging becomes a way to form that solidarity. Blocking becomes the thing of recognizing that we live in a time where people are experiencing intense adversity, and some of it is directed intentionally to particular groups. And so standing together and blocking those forces that are toxic and sort of inhumane is a thing that all caring communities do. And then it allows us to build an economy that is really rooted in values of people and place, to actually create a democracy that is a way of life, right? A way of working every day. So we have a lot of building to do, we're not going to be able to do that big building unless we also bridge more significantly than we are now, and unless we block some of that short-term, like intense adversity that our neighbors are experiencing. And we can do all of those things. In fact, they become really mutually reinforcing.
Perfect, thank you. One of the critiques in philanthropy is often that we are sometimes moving too slowly for some, and perhaps too quickly for others. I'd love it if both of you or either of you would want to reflect on, what are some of how do we think about both the short-term challenges that we're faced with alongside thinking about the long-term systemic issues, in much the same way that we are thinking about in the context of our own work, how do we put money into people's hands right now, but also how do we build systems that can help to support and perpetuate change ongoing. But could you talk about just any reflections on philanthropy, the work that we're doing, and the challenges or opportunities?
I'm happy to. Yeah, it's a great question, and again, I think evidenced by the style of philanthropy that you're building right here in this room is not the old style philanthropy of, pick a singular issue, concentrate on it and only it, and, let others in parallel play do their part. This is a unique feature of community foundations, is the idea that it's people first, right? It's place first. Situating that allows us to be able to do more than one thing at once. There is such a thing as multi-solving, right? We can take actions that have wide benefits. Often those co-benefits are not usually counted or acknowledged because people are looking for their particular area of concern. But in a world where we have all this interdependent sort of connections, it really helps to plan actions that are going to advance multiple goals at once. And that allows us to be able to work in the short term and talk about urgent needs as an expression in many ways of a system that was never designed for everybody to thrive. And so when people are experiencing adversity and placing demand on our sort of scarce resources for urgent services, that should be a signal that we have unfinished work to do in the long term. And that can begin today, right now, to invest in a class of things that we talk about as vital conditions, right? Not things that are temporary for some people in a crisis, but things that everybody pretty much needs every day, and we need intergenerationally, right? Like short-term adversity that happens sort of within our lifetime, right? We have moments of triumph and tragedy, and very often many of us need help. But vital conditions, things like clean air, clean water, nutritious food, humane housing, reliable transportation, lifelong learning, meaningful work and wealth, all these basic needs for health and safety. And at the center of it, this connection to feel that we belong, that we are able to build the civic muscle to do things together. These are vital conditions that we encounter sort of on day one, and we pass them on to future generations. And so when we start investing in those vital conditions, they can have intergenerational effects. And a lot of the art and science of this work is figuring out what is the mix of our portfolio, right? You can't flip a switch and sort of stop the urgent services. Even if you could, practically, it would be inhumane. And then the reverse is true. We can't spend so much time dealing with the current crisis that we don't dream for and work for a very different world. The last thing I'll say about this is it is a symptom of a dysfunctional and divisive system that makes us all breathless and think that all we can do is keep up with the crisis of the moment. That is one of the functions of a divisive system, and we can name it and we can undo that, but it takes actions that are willing to negotiate what is our well-being portfolio in this region. And I see that negotiation happening live right here. I mean, it is often not the subject of a trade-off discussion, right? How are we going to find our path through the adversity we face now into a much more thriving future? Nobody can dictate what that path is, but the people who walk it together.
Wow, you all are really helping to strengthen my vocabulary this morning. Multi-solving, vital conditions, well-being portfolio, I appreciate it. And Cat, you introduced this notion of predatory inclusion. Could you expound a little bit about what you mean when you talk about predatory inclusion?
Absolutely. Firstly, I will say I've been so heartened over the past few years, I'd say 5 years, about philanthropy's role in work around the racial wealth gap. Some philanthropies really were at the spearheading this work with the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, some of the things that were taking theory out of the ivory tower and really trying to work with people on the ground to see what does it mean? How can it change grant-making strategies? What is the amount that needs to be invested into communities? And at this point, philanthropy plays such an important role in blending funding from the private sector and public sector, which we're seeing unprecedented amounts of resources coming in, but the ability to drive it into your partners' portfolios for things that are really, really meaningful while keeping your eye on a North Star is such a welcome breath of fresh air, I will say. Predatory inclusion is, it's a complicated kind of framing that has come out more recently. It comes out of, thinking about the civil rights movement that is also, a 50, 60-year endeavor that we were born into, that we're inheriting, that we have an opportunity to continue the legacy of. There are some things that we've learned about how subprime lending happened, about how student loan debt has been structured, that can give us pause, but also can give us very clear ideas about what does equity mean. And I always want to bring it back to equity for the communities I work with. It's the people who are the furthest from justice, who need to be served first and the most. So that now and later framing is very important, but also for whom do we do this work? Low to moderate income, low wealth, Black and brown people are furthest from justice, right? As they say, in some circles around how do we conceptualize the problem, to think about also how do we disproportionately allocate resources while talking about how we need to get people to a level playing field so that we can do an equality approach. And those are very different things. Justice presupposes that everything is equal and all we need is access and opportunity. What we see today is the outcomes are not, the intent doesn't match the impact. So thinking about predatory inclusion, there are opportunities, I think, for more privileged and powerful actors coming into the work to really drill down and look at what kind of products, services, programs are being rolled out. How do we learn from history to ensure that our intention does create the kind of economic outcome we're looking for? These dollars coming out in these days and times are unprecedented, trillions and trillions of dollars in the past few years. We saw that the PPP didn't quite hit the way we wanted it to. We do see that some of the resources that came through those stimulus checks through a very different approach did reach the people. So there is a lot to learn. We're kind of still in the midst of that moment. What's the infrastructure that needs to be in place to ensure that our goals really land the way that we hope that they do? So it's a cautionary tale, I would say. When we know that student loan debt is something that is new and it came alongside the access to education, right? And that at the same time tuition costs went up. When we disaggregate the data, we know most of that debt is held by women and a disproportionate amount of that debt is held by Black women. So there's something also about needing to understand not just work or wages or wealth, but thinking about debt, assets. Are those appreciating? Are they liabilities? Like, how are we thinking about holding assets, to your point, Bobby, for intergenerational transfer of advantage? We also know there is an intergenerational transfer of disadvantage, and that is just a feature of our society. We can disrupt this, and I'm very excited by the amount of sectors leaning in, public sector, private sector, nonprofit, philanthropy, alongside the people. This is not something that has happened historically. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you. I'm so busy taking notes here. It's hard to keep up. I really appreciate the way that you all are sharing your expertise and creating learning opportunities for all of us. I'd love it if, and again, I know that this audience is hungry for some of the additional things around what we as Community Foundation can do to create this sense of belonging, shared sense of purpose. So I want to create the space for you all, and we'll do 2 more questions here, and then create the space for some questions from the audience for a little more engagement. Danielle, is that okay with you? Perfect. Can we talk about the, how we ought to begin to think, again, continue to think about this sense of belonging that we want to create in the region, again, given all the backdrop of all the things, Bobby, to the point earlier, that are happening in the context of our world and this community specifically.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. It's one of the most powerful and fragile things that historically we haven't paid nearly enough attention to, but it is becoming more and more of a concern in an era when people experience loneliness and disconnection or exclusion in all kinds of ways. We start to recognize that we have this deep human need to feel connected and also to contribute. And yeah, we are unique people in a common world with very different families and different cultures and all these intersecting identities. But the systems that we've built have never really been created for everyone to thrive together. And the together part is a big piece of this because of all that plurality, all that multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic vitality, which is often used as a reason to divide each other, but really can be an asset that we bring to the work that we have to do together. And so belonging turns out to really matter if people don't think that they have a sort of fundamental human dignity as themselves and that their flourishing matters. One of the scariest statistics these days is how many young people feel that they don't matter. I'm talking 50+% statewide in many states. It's terrifying, and that can be reversed, right? It can be reversed through small actions, very local actions that say that you matter. And then converting that belonging into its pair, which is we describe as civic muscle. I know there's some new words being here, but new thinking requires new words very often, so that we begin to talk about the things that we historically haven't put enough attention on. And belonging and civic muscle, they travel together. The more that people feel connected, the more that we have assets to contribute to. We have very big challenges in the world that often produce a sense of they sort of backfire. The bigger the challenge, the more like, well, that's a big problem for somebody else. I don't know what to do about it. And people sort of disconnect, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now we have bigger and bigger problems. Nobody knows how to do it. So the 2 challenges, and I've learned this from many, many colleagues across the world, and a great teacher and Native Hawaiian leader who says, we really have 2 issues. One is we have to be able to see a future, and we have to believe that we can navigate there over time. And that belief that we can navigate there, that each of us have something to bring, it can be very it could lead us into a vicious cycle of division, or it can lead us into a virtuous cycle of bringing our best together. And we have a long tradition of making great strides in this country toward well-being and justice, but they've all been fragile. They've been met with backlash. We haven't necessarily consolidated those gains and done even more for the unfinished potential of this work. And so belonging is the beginning of that conversation. It's not the end. The last thing I'll say about this is once it becomes visible and valued, we need to make it investable. We need to be something that we can invest in building belonging and civic muscle as the product of what, in many ways, the assets of this community, this capital campaign, you're converting that into a wider sense of belonging, a deeper strength of civic muscle, and then you can see it expressed across education and housing, and in your tally of all the things that this foundation is investing in is an example, but in between the story of like the money and the uses is the belonging and the civic muscle that you're creating for the big we that matters here.
I think, Bobby covered a lot of what belonging is. I think the question is, how do we do some of these things, right? And like I said, think and do tank. It's really trying things out, figuring out what works, and really what can be universalized. So, I've been in 17 cities, 13 states, working with almost 100 Black and Brown-led nonprofits to create something meaningful for clients who are 0 to 80% area median income, who are asset limited based on, requirements by federal government funding. What is most important for a sense of belonging, and I think we all have heard these kind of things, is the table designed for the people who've been excluded? Is it that we're asking them to come to a place that might harm instead of help? And how do we actually design something that empowers? And I use that word very in a different type of way. How do we value the power of the people to actually design the solutions and administer the solutions, become a part of creating that change? So it's not done to people, it's done with them. So human-centered approaches are vital, and they are slightly different than the way that we do engagement of communities that is often tokenistic and representational. We like the voice in the face. We love a picture of people with pain, but how do we help people to think about their lived experience as power? And it's been one of the most incredible things in how nonprofits change how they do their work. That actually does change outcomes for those very clients who become experts. They pay them, like consulting wages for participation, not a gift card. It's a very different way of thinking about the power of narrative, of story, of lived experience. But what is most interesting is it resonates in a very different way with philanthropy. So we're seeing our organizations are developing impact funds that are explicit. There's one out of Seattle, the Black Futures Cooperative Fund, set up after the murder of George Floyd by 4 Black women in the state of Washington, drew down $11 million in 1 year with the supportive backing of the Seattle Community Foundation, who does not own the fund. They are helping the community to steward the fund, and they're hoping to build a $248 million endowment, $1 million for every year of enslavement. So it's very fascinating, that I think we're hungry for something different. And what we have to understand is a lot of that innovation, a lot of the creativity that we yearn for is genius left on the table. Because of the ways that systems include and exclude the people most impacted, but there's such a powerful groundswell and a moment to step into a movement that was started well before any of us were born, and to really see change quickly. I think that's the other thing. People are fatigued. They call it racial battle fatigue for those of us born into the struggle. But the belonging, the need for all people to be a part of whichever part of the assembly line of justice is needed, right? We can go further together faster. And I think that's the moment that we're in. We have an amazing opportunity to live our values.
Thank you. Beautifully spoken. I want to turn very quickly. I have a final question for the panel, but I'm going to save it. It's asking for their predictions. But I want to see if there are any questions from the floor or any reflections or remarks from the floor. Yeah, over here. There's a mic coming your way.
Good morning. Jorge Figueredo, Executive Director of EduFuturo, an organization that is providing services to immigrants, children of immigrants, and first-generation college students. We also work with their parents, and I can tell you that what the pandemic has done to the families that we serve is incredible and is very devastating. And I hear this, I commend you for what you're saying, but there is a difference between where you are and where the reality is right now. And I can tell you that there is we're living a crisis right now among the students and the young people that we work with, and it's called chronic absenteeism. And right now, we're losing every day thousands and thousands of students that are dropping out of schools, that they could be the next engineer, the next medical doctor, the next lawyer, but we're not. So what I wanna tell you, just to give you an example, in Fairfax County, we partner, very small investment, $200,000. And with that, we're able to bring back 240 kids that otherwise would be dropouts right now, would be a statistic. So I just wanted to bring this to your attention because I love, my God, I see those millions and millions of dollars, and I'm like, can we get something for the organizations like, the ones that are here with the boots on the ground to properly operate? Because there is another issue. We depend so much on programmatic grants, but in the philanthropic world, there is no money for operations. So how do you expect us to be able to properly deliver the programs? And you're right, we're exhausted. We're working so hard every day, 12, 16 hours per day, helping those that need the most. But the people that are doing it also needed it. And if you don't think about that, that's something that is important to think about too. Because for us, if we lose one person that is doing the job on the ground, that's devastating. Because think about the numbers of hundreds of people that otherwise we will be able to keep up, to keep our society moving. So I just wanted to call it to your attention and figure out ways that we can make this, really something where we can continue making the American dream to happen to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have one reaction.
Sure,
First of all, thank you for sharing the story, and thank you for the work that you do. It illustrates one of the broader problems or opportunities in the way that we think about investment. We asked a nationwide poll of people who were in a position to sort of be change makers. What is your preference for equitable investment? And we gave them choices about give money and resources evenly and equally to everybody, those that need just a little more help, or those that have the most to gain. And I promise you that there was no majority in that. A lot of people thought evenly and equally sounded fair and equitable to them. We all know that that is not when there's not a level playing field to start with. Those that need just a little more help are not the people that you're talking about, right? Because there's a dynamic going on there that is not just like on the edge, and the pandemic was the thing that pushed it over. There was a lot of vulnerability pre-pandemic, and until we recognize that the people that you're talking about, and you've illustrated it quite marvelously, with not a lot of resource, you can make significant changes in people's life course. That's an illustration of people who have the most to gain. And how do we make that the norm for our investments? It is not the norm mindset now, but it probably has to be if we're going to start marrying this commitment to those that have things to teach us all about what a system that's built for everybody looks and feels like. So the people that you're talking about can be the champions in much the way that, Cat, you were describing. Like, we can all learn something about people who've been positioned with such disregard, but who, as we bring them back into the circle of concern, then become the champions of work that tell us when we've built a system that we can all be proud of.
I also want to thank you for bringing the lived experience of your community to this room. These are the things that call me to action. I can say, and I'm comfortable saying, I also was a high school dropout and did not go to college until I was 30. So these issues are very close to my spirit. They are the reason that I get up in the morning. I was lucky enough to then do an undergrad and then do a master's in London, but I was very much told that I was unteachable. One of the biggest challenges for our young people, and I love that we focus on segmented demographics of our society, but that also doesn't encapsulate the belonging of people in a family unit, right? Our children are struggling because their parents are struggling. Their parents work. And there is not a lot of conversation about the need for an investment in whole families, right? We segment people. Instead of thinking about what does the mother of that family need? What does the father of that family need? What do the aunties, the grandma? When we have multi-generational impoverishment in one home, it's hard to think I should just go and work. If I go to college and I go to work, I'm going to have a big debt load. I'm probably not going to get paid properly because of a wage and gender gap, a race and gender gap, right? And then we don't have the resources, so it actually creates a burden for the family. Understanding not the psychology of people, but what systems do, how there is a biopsychosocial process. Something about what we live in, we take into our bodies, and it does impact what we think is possible for our futures. I love that in these days and times we have more people elected who come from communities. We have more people in positions of power who come from communities, and more people, this isn't new to us, but more people who are willing to say the thing that we used to be stigmatized about, because in order to make it in the past, to be included and to belong, you had to assimilate. We are now becoming more of a multicultural community. England was multicultural, now it's becoming assimilationist. We're the opposite. So I think we also have to have grace for ourselves to understand that we are living in a very different time. We have a lot of different opportunities, but we also need a holistic, comprehensive understanding of why we see different kinds of outcomes for women, children, elders. There's something that we need to fund holistically, and the Journal of American Medicine recently looked at the racial wealth gap and said if we were able to close this, we would increase life expectancy by 5 years for Black people. That number is $825,000 a year. If you think about Dr. William Sandy Darity's analysis of what is the amount that is owed, $17 trillion divided by 43 million people is 825,000. So when we're thinking about what does disproportionate allocation of resources mean, we need to peg it to data, I believe, right? Otherwise, we're putting Band-Aids on something that we could make a very big investment in. And it can happen if we're looking across all the sectors of society that hold resources.
We help families. We work with the kids, but we work with the parents, and we work as an intergenerational approach. We do it with case management, we do it with education, we do it with force development, and we have a proven method that in 6 years we can take a person that is a nurse from El Salvador that is making $10 an hour from a retirement facility to now making $57,000 at the Innova Hospital in Fairfax. And her daughter, who was one of our students that went to high school and now college, is now a pharmacist technician at CVS. We took a family making $40,000 a year in 6 years, now is making close to $100,000. So we can make it happen. It's just being able to give those funds to the places where they can make the difference.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, I really, really appreciate the work that you are doing. And you're making a good point that philanthropy has made some shifts, and we have to continue to make shifts. We have to really make sure that we are creating space for nonprofit organizations and the leaders therein to respond to the needs that are happening in real time, which means more general operating resources so that you can have that kind of flexibility. I appreciated you bringing into the conversation sort of what we refer to often as two-generation strategies or multiple generation strategies for supporting families. I am often struck by just the level of rejection that young people especially face in our community. And I know that so many of us are really concerned about the uptick in violence and the uptick in harm in various communities without often doing some bit of reflection on ourselves and the role that we may or may not be playing. But I have the good fortune of being around young people often, and often young people who are in the job market, across various skill sets, some with high school diplomas, some with college degrees. And I can tell you the level of rejection that young people are facing in the employment market is really scary, it's disappointing. Imagine that if you have limited access to social circles and social networks, and your only way to apply for a job is online, on Indeed or on through some of the search engines, and you never get a call back, or you never get an email that says, we've selected someone else. I don't know that we are fully appreciating the microaggressions that people are experiencing every single day in trying to participate actively in economic life or in community life, and not necessarily. So the internet has done some really amazing things when it comes to creating the opportunity for social engagement, but it's also created some new barriers that I don't think we fully appreciate when it comes to how young people are experiencing their own interest in trying to connect with the local economy. That's just one example that comes to me. I mean, often I feel it deeply and personally because of just how it's playing out in my life and in broad-based community life as well. Are there other questions or thoughts or reflections from the floor? I want to make sure that we create the time and space for any final thoughts. Okay, hearing none, I want to put the final questions to Cat and to Bobby. I asked you on the phone to help us think about the future, and I'd love it if you could just project out the next 2 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years, your predictions. We've talked about some of the worst case scenarios, so you can decide if you want to go worst case and best case, or choose one or the other. But best case scenarios for how things are going to play out in society and what our options and opportunities are to shape some of those things. Who wants to go? Kat, do you want to go first? Okay, Bobby.
I think, Kat, you said this earlier, like we live in a pivotal moment, and that holds great promise. It also holds a lot of peril. And so I think we could see a future that is, it's really poised for a really, a sort of proving true, a dynamic that we see over and over again, that when systems collapse, people rise. And despite all this adversity, maybe even because of all this adversity, we end up turning toward each other and start making the values that we hold in common, the things that connect our heads and our hands and our hearts, into the things that we do, the work that people do, not just voting or volunteering, but everyday work that people do at whatever range of influence that is, over their own lives, over their families, the organizations they're a part of. If we can build sort of habits of shared stewardship into people's mindset and practice, and if that starts kind of personally, and then we work in and through the organizations that we frankly create together, and move those organizations to start caring about things that they historically didn't, to start investing in things they didn't do before, to start reaching across the walls of our organizations and not pretend that it's a giant game of parallel play and somehow it's going to add up to a better system, but become more interdependent with each other. What can philanthropy and government and business and schools and hospitals start doing together because of the love of people and place and children's future? If that starts to be the mark of our era, then I think we could see this as a moment of great renaissance. There's a quote that Arthur Miller says, the definition of an era is when our illusions are exhausted, right? We've got a lot of illusions that the economy will work, the democracy will work, individualism will pay off. All these illusions of separateness have really gotten in the way, and those are being quickly exhausted by the lived experience of more and more of us who are seeing a future in doubt, and that could be turned into the hard work of guaranteeing that we don't go down that road, that we can go a different way. But it's very fragile, and it's going to take some serious work by the people in this room and many people who are not in this room. And so that other road is also very real, right? This corrosive, divisive dynamic powered by disinformation and misinformation could cause us to not trust anything, to not see a future that matters, and worse, to not believe that we could have any role in changing it. And then that's a dark path. It can get a lot darker than it is right now. So how do we see this as a test of our humanity and our resilience to be able to do something that is, as you said, long generations before us, human societies would never have evolved if we didn't have the capability of caring for each other. But it's fragile and it has to be renewed even in times of crisis, and I think we're in one of those moments.
There's a quote that I always really am inspired by. Another world is possible, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Arundhati Roy. I think the moment that we're in, Bobby, you had mentioned while we were on conversation about being good ancestors. Some of us are born into this struggle, right? It is not a choice. Do we feel, I was looking at belonging, comfort, connection, and contribution? Not historically. But the world has shifted. There has been a shift in polarity. For some, amazing reason, we listen to voices that we have not heard before. We are more committed than ever to thinking about these challenges as issues of a system, not individuals. That gives us so many more opportunities to do the good work. Also, a lot of us who were not allowed to express our culture in a country that didn't really allow immigration have a new place to speak since 1965, where we opened up immigration and we understand differently how people and families and communities and cultures actually buttress us. They're protective factors when we are in hostile environments that cause trauma, to your point. Microaggressions, death by 1,000 cuts. What we have to understand about exclusion, and I learned this in England and it was really profound to me, our body reads ostracism as physical pain. If we are thinking about these multi-sectoral challenges targeting individuals, think about the feeling of what people wake up with every day and the inability to stem it, to block the pain. And yet we persevere. There is something that we really need to lean into differently, and we do need to put the resources where our values are. What they say, a budget is a moral document. We invest in what we value. So I love values-driven work. I also want to see the money go where, our heart is. There is a very powerful moment, and this gentleman, what you expressed to me was more important than anything, the return on investment, right? We always are talking about what's the ROI. In 6 years, you can double the income of a family with a very nominal investment. And it gives you a social return, it gives you an economic return. Likely, it's also giving a political return because people feel they have power to affect change in the lives of their loved ones. And they're doing it in an environment that is the connective tissue that cares. Whether we have more bodies coming down the river, this downstream approach, we do need both and. There's an opportunity to change systems while changing conditions, and those people, once they're integrated more fully in the economy, change how we think and do the work. We cannot change what we cannot name, James Baldwin said. And we do need to be the people that we've been waiting for, as June Jordan says.
Please join me in giving a huge round of applause to Cat and Bobby. Really, really appreciate the work that you do in your individual spaces and the way that you've been able to powerfully communicate and share those expressions of hope, challenge, the new vocabulary around belonging and civic muscle, worker wages, wealth. There's so many things that I was able to capture that help to describe and offer new language of possibility for our work. As we are wrapping up the session for today, I just want to end with just a few words. First, let me just offer a huge thank you to all of you for showing up, for being present, for being partners with and to this community and to our community foundation. So let's give yourselves a round of applause.